Hello, everyone. My name is Graham Brookie. I am the director and managing editor of the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council, and welcome to this session entitled Tricking the Trolls, a Look at the Digital Future. This is an incredibly important conversation for a set of challenges that will be, not only emerging, it's a set of challenges that we don't have a good handle over just yet because of its emerging nature. And it's an appropriate conversation to be having at the first annual NATO Youth Summit, given the fact that the best policy pitches will likely be coming from a next generation of leaders on this set of issues, especially the technical aspects of this. If you're joining online, engage at hashtag NATO 2030. You can ask us questions as well. We'll hear from fellow panelists for the next 15 minutes or so, but this is very much intended to be an engagement as opposed to a presentation. So I cannot wait to hear from my colleagues. We're going to hear first from Dhruv Ghulati, who's the founder of Factmata in London. We will then hear from Benjamin Strick, who is a journalist with BBC Africa Eye, also based in London. And then we'll hear from Amy Trillard, who is the Strategic Communications and Policy Plans Officer in the PDD division, Public Diplomacy Division of NATO, piping in from Brussels. So without further ado, the one point that I would just make is that this set of challenges is absolutely not only a international issue for the alliance to grapple with and work together on, it's also a domestic issue in each one of our countries. You have to look no further, as the American on the line, you have to look no further than US elections for the threat of disinformation, trolling, foreign interference, and any number of these things that are slightly separate policy issues, but all intertwine into the same challenge of building digital resilience and working with partners and allies going forward. So without further ado, I will turn first to Dhruv, and very much thank you for joining us. Don't hesitate to ask questions as we go. Don't wait till the end of the conversation to ask your question. Put them in the chat, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Dhruv.
Thanks a lot, Graham. So, so let me kind of start by introducing who I am and what Factmata really is. So, we founded Factmata in 2017 after an initial kind of grant from Google, and we were one of the first UK startups to take on the problem of misinformation, disinformation, and one of the first kind of commercial entities providing an actual solution to this on the UK government tendering system. We've raised kind of donor funding from the founders of Twitter, the US billionaire Mark Cuban, and more. So we built some early technology to automatically detect disinformation by extracting what we call controversial narratives. So we essentially piece together opinions from multiple platforms and combine them together. We also have an ability to rank narratives that are evolving on social media by their threat level, which is essentially learned by combining multiple linguistic classifiers that can understand the existence of propagandist tone, controversial topics, bot-generated language, hyperpartisanship, toxicity, threatening language, hate speech, and a lot more. And we were able to actually extract the key actors that are involved in any given narrative that's spreading online. And there's sort of words and phrases that they use. I wanted to talk about kind of why I think disinformation is one of the largest international security risks that we have today. And I think the way I think about it is that I think it's so dangerous because of the way it destabilizes and turns countries against themselves. So most disinformation actually originates from real people and not just what we call social media bots, which are automated anonymous accounts. It's often lawmakers, journalists, public figures that are actually recruited in, whether directly or indirectly, to actually go and spread disinformation. And I think the other thing that makes it so dangerous is that our adversaries in Russia and other countries like China are actually very, very far ahead from what I see than the West. These state-sponsored sort of conspiracies and hoaxes are being spread in broad daylight on social media. You can actually use the free Twitter API and you can pick up a lot of this type of content. We've seen things about NATO related to, for example, narratives around how NATO doesn't support the US or democracy, or claiming that NATO is withdrawing or deploying troops in certain situations, or even killing and raping women and children. So these narratives then get amplified very easily by these bot accounts that are set up specifically to create this discord. I think another point I wanted to make in this is that state-sponsored actors have sort of realized that Western governments don't really have the legislative frameworks to actually take this problem on. What's interesting is that a lot of national cybersecurity departments don't yet have a dedicated disinformation division with a budget assigned and an office is specifically responsible for dealing with these types of threats. And so these departments are having to siphon resources from departments that were previously responsible for information leaks and malware and email hacking and things like this. So from a technology perspective, the tech has become good enough to provide signals as to potential disinformation, doctored images, videos, trolls, hate speech. But these signals are provided to human beings that actually have to go in and decide if something is disinformation or not. The contextualization and analysis and verification task is still a human task. And humans are too slow for the dissemination capabilities of social media. By the time AI is able to detect something like astroturfing or sock puppets, it's actually had the effect of already sowing fear and anxiety on the internet. And what I find also quite interesting in this entire problem is that the forces that are actually shaping social media, that fund the growth of easier sharing, liking, commenting on social media, that are actually used in things like social media marketing or influencer marketing or growth hacking, the same technology is being deployed in these disinformation campaigns, which shows me that when marketing technology and ad tech grow, the risk of this disinformation is going to increase. So what I wanted to kind of raise as a kind of points for discussion in my talk was to talk about a few kind of things that I think are important from policy. Number one, it's really important for platforms to open up data access. There are data sets being released in the from past elections or past incidents, but it's impossible for organizations like my own and researchers to actually analyze this information in real time as it operates. The second thing is actually launching disinformation departments within cybersecurity divisions and actually assigning own budgets and people. The third thing is actually what's most important in this situation is to think about how we as countries can build better communities amongst each other to actually counter the nasty rhetoric that we see is being spread. Finally, talking about actual coordinated counter narratives. So I think a lot of focus has been, particularly in the AI world, on actually detecting disinformation. But what I would like to advocate for is thinking through how we can actually positively recruit nano influencers, people who actually are positive about the future of our nations, to actually go and support and spread these positive narratives and take those disinformation troll accounts on. I think another thing is around funding. We're fortunate to have raised some initial seed funding, but it's not nearly enough to actually build and maintain the technology that I think is necessary to detect disinformation across languages in real time and at scale. And I think I'd finish off by saying that I think I'd like to see more focus on actually funding the future rather than fixing the past. Often the debate is placed on the focus isn't placed on what Facebook or Google are doing. And I'm grateful to NATO for having invited some smaller, newer organizations to share our voices. I'd love to see funding and focus on new initiatives that, for example, are focusing on building new social media platforms that maybe fund themselves differently or have different methods of ranking content or involve their users more. So I'd sort of end by saying that there's a lot to be done in this space, and I'm looking forward to some of the questions that kind of come up through this talk.
Thank you so much, Drew. And fascinating points to kind of hit on in conversation, especially 1, 2, and 3. The thing that I picked up was especially the funding and coordination within national governments, as well as working across allies and partners in some of the technical aspects. Now we'll turn over to Benjamin Strick with BBC Africa Eye.
Thank you so much, Graham. And thank you so much for having me here today. So my name is Ben Strick. Just to start with, for the good part of a decade, I've been working with data online in various projects centered around public interest. And a lot of that has been using open source to document serious wrongdoing with BBC Africa Eye. But there has been a trend towards poisoning that data that we look at online. And there has been also a community growing to tackle that trend. And so while most of my work has been using information online to document serious conflicts on the ground, I'm going to take you away from that. And I'm going to explain this problem by telling you about an account on Twitter that I came across in 2019. The account went by the Twitter handle Marco267. And Marco, on the surface, looked like any other user on Twitter. He had a name, a photo of him on a holiday, a profile bio with interests and likes. But Marco only tweeted about 2 things: the great work the Indonesian government did for West Papua, and critical views of anyone who sought to speak up about West Papuan independence and human rights. 20 years ago, Marco could have been an opinionated person in a bar, at a university, or a columnist with a focus on issues in the Pacific. But in 2020, he's not. What Marco is a product of an Indonesian marketing firm that hired young students to create fake accounts, setting them on an automated posting pattern and let them run wild. It was that marketing firm that myself and another researcher found responsible for running Marco267, along with hundreds of other similar accounts posting the exact same message across social media platforms and running several websites. The marketing firm even had social media accounts that were set up as news blogs and paid for advertisements to push the same narratives and fake news articles criticizing activists and human rights lawyers. Now, the reason why I'm here today and I want to speak is not to rubbish the tech platforms, and it's not even to advocate for political or human rights issues across the world, but rather I'm here to talk about the landscape that has changed the way that propaganda, information, and narratives are shared, liked, and used to subject people to hate, polarization, and nation-state interests. I'm definitely not alone in seeing this issue. We're all becoming very well aware of it. And I even know some of the people in this forum here and this conference, and are acquainted with some of those people just through this mutual drive to tackle this problem. Now, to give you an idea of just a brief size of the issue, a 2019 research project by University of Oxford provided insight into this dangerous trend, and it documented the evidence of organized social media campaigns, manipulation campaigns. So there were 28 countries in 2017, 48 in 2018, and 70 in 2019. That's 70 countries where accounts like Marco267 are distorting the narrative. Now, those findings are pretty surreal, but they show that those networks were identified, analyzed, and attributed, and that research was done by research communities. And it's those research communities that have given me the experience and partnerships and chance to be here today talking to you, to talk about accounts like Marco267. And it's the power of those online research communities that provides 2 things in my eyes. It adapts to problems, trends, and works together to tackle common issues. And it fosters new minds like what we have here, professionals, and theories to do that. And it's in that community that I was able to collaborate with other researchers and do this investigation. It's in that community that gave me the amazing opportunities I've had to learn and work on this content. And it's in that community and many other information operations similar to this one in West Papua have been unveiled and taken down. So what can bodies like NATO do to help developing environment and counter disinformation and influence operations? In my eyes, the key is to boosting and working with these communities that foster learning, collaboration, and research. It's in the power of these collaborative communities and workspaces that we can find the strongest point to tackle the next generation of influence and information operations, just like the power of that collaborative community, which saw the end of Marco 267. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ben. My takeaways there are we all, anybody that has worked in the counter disinfo community has some old friends or Twitter accounts, or the Twitter accounts that feel like old friends that always pop up when they're spreading disinformation, like Marco267. But I think that the point about exposure through documentation, which in and of itself tells a very compelling story about accountability and transparency. And then absolutely, we've all benefited from a truly dedicated community that shares a common purpose across this. So extremely well. I hope that we very much pick up on that in conversation as well. But before that, we will hear from our colleague Amy in Brussels. Oh, Amy, we're having audio issues with your headphones, I believe.
No way. Amy, you're not. Maybe you plug up.
This happens more often than not. Can't quite hear you yet, although we hear you coming in over phone. To our audience on the other side of the screen, this is all part of working with friends and allies.
Would you remove your plugin from the computer? Remove the plugin. Wonderful, I hear you.
I believe that we can hear on telephone, but we can't hear on the screen just yet. Bear with us for just one moment as we have technical difficulties. For those of you that are tuning in the evening, it's morning here on the west coast of the United States. I thought I was going to be the one with technical difficulties because it's massively snowing where I'm at right now. And Amy, while we figure out your technical aspects over the phone, we're going to tune into just one quick question, and we'll turn it over to, I think that this is probably a really good question for Benjamin and Dhruv to an extent. The first question comes from Slovakia. Trolls organized by foreign powers target specifically social cohesion of member countries. So this is a unique challenge in which we are absolutely the target, but we're also the vulnerability and have been for some time. So how can social cohesion be strengthened and defended, which I think speaks to how do we build resilience in our own nation states as we work with allies and partners? Ben, do you want to take a first stab at that? And then over to Dhruv?
Sure. Just hide my phone since we have the compulsory loudspeaker on it and there's some music going through there at the moment. So, I mean, for me, and I'm not too experienced in sort of giving massive amounts or widespread bits of advice, as much of my training and I do sort of train on this subject as well is about training the sort of technicalities of looking at these networks. But one thing I've noticed is that the people that fall prey and oftentimes the networks that these groups target, it's often shared by perhaps those that are less digitally literate than others. And from my understanding, I do think there is a common level of digital literacy that may be able to combat things such as just small bouts of disinformation that may have a bigger narrative in being state-backed. I mean, it's hard to say to an entire population, please use image reverse search, or please double check every single Twitter handle and go through their followers and things like that. But just to have some of that concept in there to say, hey, this thing that you're retweeting or this thing that you're liking or sharing might actually come from something that's not fact, or might come from somewhere other than just providing you information, which is what news sources are supposed to be. So in my eyes, I think it's about increasing digital literacy over the entire population is a way to combat the widespread effectiveness of disinformation campaigns.
Yes.
Extremely well
A
said.
quick point on that one is I think like I was mentioning in my initial kind of speech, is that I think a lot of focus is on checking things, teaching people how to be more digitally literate, or checking trolls, or checking fake news, and whatever it is. But I really see not enough focus on thinking about new social media platforms and adequately funding them to come up with ideas for what might be the next Facebook, or what might be the next Twitter. It's so infeasible for us to even imagine a world with that happening. But if it was actually thought through, I think I'd love to see, and we've been thinking through that for a long time, is what will be the next social media platform that encourages community, encourages people to be happy and satisfied in their communities and connecting with each other, and doing it not for some alternate goal of the platform, but actually genuinely to enjoy being in that platform. I would love to see more focus on thinking through that.
And that's a trend that we've seen. I mean, just taking the most recent example with a shift not only in communities, but also, frankly, more so the actors that spread disinformation to alternative platforms, especially here in the United States. I'm told that we have Amy now online, or on audio,
Yes.
I should say. But we'll turn over to you, Amy. How are you?
I'm good. How are you guys? I hope you can hear me now. It's, yep, thumbs up. That means you can. Okay, so I'm Amy Triard. I work on policy and planning in NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, and that includes with some focus on NATO's response to disinformation. So as we're thinking about what the world will look like in 2030 and how NATO will need to adapt, for me, I think that it's essential that we're thinking also about changes in the information landscape and how to sharpen NATO's own communications through investment in digital, in technologies, in our own skills, as well as using data to support decision making. And then one of the most prominent areas that we're looking at, of course, is how to deal with hostile information. And we try not to say just disinformation. It's such an important term that everybody's thinking about, that we do say it a lot, but we also think about misinformation, propaganda, influence operations, foreign interference, etc. So what I wanted to raise is that going forward, the sophistication of disinformation is only going to continue to grow. It's only going to get harder to identify. And so for this reason, I see two key areas where NATO needs to be involved while it's looking to 2030. And so those two areas are building societal resilience to disinformation, and then broader engagement with social media and technology platforms. So I'll just say a few words on both of those. So firstly, looking at building resilience among citizens, I think that if the pandemic has shown us something, it's that the sheer amount of information out there available online, it can be overwhelming, and you can't always rely on it being true. And then at the same time, we find people sticking to their own bubbles, their own biases online. And when it's out there, this false information, it can spread quickly. So overall, we're finding ourselves at this moment of digital enlightenment where we need the whole of society to be learning essential skills needed to survive in the digital age. And so as we're looking at the way people are acquiring information is continuing to evolve, and then the proportion of digital natives expanding dramatically, we also need to be thinking about their resilience, because going ahead, it's going to be even more necessary for people to critically assess the information that they receive and be able to challenge it at the source if it is something that is not quite truthful. So I think that NATO should be at the forefront of this work, and in particular working with member countries whose communications capacities are relatively modest. And when we're thinking about this effort, it needs to be about strengthening civil society and also supporting free, independent, and pluralistic media. And then at the same time, we need to be looking to NATO's digital outreach and having it adapt over time and making sure that we're making best use of tools and technologies and content to engage with our audiences in a meaningful way as a credible and trustworthy source of information. And then to my second point about NATO having a role in broader engagement with social media and technology platforms, I think that the burden of addressing hostile information, it's something that we can't be placing on governments and publicly funded institutions alone. As Ben said, we don't want to rubbish tech platforms, but at the same time, this is an issue that is bigger than governments, and so it's an area that action by big tech platforms is essential. And we've already seen good work by the platforms to address issues of false or misleading information through labeling content. But looking ahead, we also need to see more done by the platforms because the problem's not going away; it's only evolving. And so I think that NATO needs to have a voice in pressing big tech platforms to investing in managing this problem, especially when we're thinking about instances when disinformation is crossing over the line to be a security threat. So the kind of questions that I would propose to policymakers at NATO is we need to be thinking about will this how will NATO be able to take on this role? Will this be by having NATO participate in international forums or coalitions to engage with tech platforms? Or could this be about things like public expressions of support or NATO playing a role in international norm setting and standards development? And now to kind of wrap up, I would say that the issue of disinformation as a security threat, it's not something that's new for NATO. It's been around since NATO was founded and before. But it is an area that we've been investing in for a number of years now. So that would include to better understand our audiences as well as the information environment. And we're also continuously investing in our communications to ensure that we're taking the most modern approaches for an international organization, and that we're always being fact-based, truthful, and credible in our public communications. And lastly, I would say that we really need to take a step back and realize that individual actions matter. So we all need to play our part in thinking before we share information online, checking our sources, and then remembering that when we take these small actions together collectively, that this can be something that makes a big impact when we're standing up for our democratic values. And so just to close off, for me, the best way to trick the trolls in the long run is not thinking of these individual instances of disinformation and constantly, chasing after them. We need to also be investing in raising citizens' resilience over the medium to long term and making sure NATO has a voice to engage with the technology platforms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. Ed, we are very, very nearly out of time, so I'm going to do my best to ask one of the questions from the chat that basically wraps up a number of the other questions. But we're going to have a lightning round, a literally 10-second answer from everybody. The question comes from Inga in Lithuania. Why do you think disinformation and the reflexive control approach is successful against our democracy? So in other words, how do we get ahead as opposed to being inherently reactive to this? Dhruv, then Ben, then Amy, and then we're wrapping.
So the point I was making at the beginning was this idea of actually going after and spreading positive facts and information using the same techniques that are used to spread disinformation. And a lot of that can be done by essentially finding those positive people who like to share stories, social media influencers, and can actually have a voice, and using them to proactively share counter narratives.
Understood. Over to you, Ben. And I'm sorry this is such a lightning round. We got to make it quick.
It's okay. Really 2 quick points from me. Increasing digital resilience, as everyone has said, increasing the population's awareness of fake accounts, disinformation, fake profiles, and pushing the social media platforms to do more firefighting and putting your foot out on a small fire before it gets bigger.
My turn for the lightning round. I'd say on the day-to-day, we need to be in understanding the information environment, the tactics, techniques, and being ready to respond if necessary, and then really investing the majority of our effort in the long term, building resilience, and then engaging with the technology platforms.
Wonderful. And thank you to you all. This has been really, really wonderful. It's been lightning fast, and this is an issue that has so many different angles and facets and nuance, and we could go on all day and talk about each individual component for ever and ever and ever. Unfortunately, we don't have the time. The good news is that this piece of the conversation is just the latest iteration, and this being the first ever NATO Youth Summit, I expect that we'll have this conversation again and again and again as this issue evolves, which it will. We know that bad actors will evolve in the way that they use disinformation or online manipulation to target us as not only member countries, but as the alliance itself. And our response will evolve as well as we build on, as appropriately what Amy pointed out, building resilience across each one of our societies as well as the alliance. So very much thank you for joining us for this conversation today. This conversation does not end here. Thank you to all of my colleagues for joining and for your insights. Thank you to the audience. Stay engaged. We're going to use the hashtag NATO 2030 from here on out to have this until we hit 2030, and then we'll have to figure something else out. And very much looking forward to carrying on the conversation with you all. Thank you for joining.